Well, everybody, it turns out that the vast majority of video games no longer exist in any meaningful way. That might seem like an alarming statement. You might think, oh, surely you're just talking about ancient things. No, it's actually quite a bit worse than just about anybody thought. The headline stat is that 87% of games released before 2010 are unavailable to anyone. This is thanks to the Video Games History Foundation, where that is actually what they found. And across the medium's history, less than 20% of games in any given generation are actually preserved. This is a chart that shows how many games are actually easily accessible to an audience in any of these given eras. You can see that very early on there's obviously problems, but it's certainly not like these stats have got better. I mean, from years 1985 to 1994, you have more availability than like 1995 to 2004, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And what this means is fairly obvious. Unless there's a profit to be made for it, they don't really give a shit. And it's kind of fundamentally different to how things are actually working out in other mediums. And I think this is what was really, for me, the bit that made me feel it, what actually sent it home. Compared to studies of other creative mediums, the availability rate of pre-2010 video games, 13%, is similar to the commercial availability of pre-World War II audio recordings, 10% or less, or the survival rate of American silent era films, 14%. So, in preservation terms, that means that a medium that has existed entirely within the span of the last 60 years has got similar preservation problems compared to things that existed 100 plus years ago from the present day. And in a way, it does kind of make sense, because most of the games that are not commercially popular end up being stuck behind technical limitations where there's just not enough modders to fix the problem. There's no drive to restore these kind of old mid-tier 7 out of 10 games for modern audiences. Yet, if you want to play Tetris or Pong or whatever, even the most original version, you can, because those have shown their popularity. But here's an interesting example of it. Let's just say you played a small little indie game called Elden Ring, and you thought, where did that company come from? And you found out that their first title is a game called King's Field. There's a sequel that is also named King's Field in the English version. This is now unavailable from any source other than going through full ROM emulation. And I think that example is ultimately this sort of point wrote large, right? Where a lot of games that are actually important to the medium, that allow audiences to understand the growth and the development of games as an art form, are just not accessible in any real way. And some of them are cultural juggernauts, right? I mean, what about games that provide context for a culture? A really good example then is the Commodore 64, right? That is spoken of in this study as an abandoned ecosystem, with less than 4.5% of the Commodore 64's total game library ever being made available again. 3.375% of that total library came from one company dedicated to reissuing those games. One company. Without them, what would that number look like? It would be absolutely minuscule. And what's shocking is if you thought this was only happening to absolute ancient games that you could almost call boomer games and be right, no, it's not that. Because the digital era has actually not done a lot to change this problem, which is really the bit that shocked me. Games released from 2005 to 2009, so the beginning of the era of digital distribution, maybe your Xbox Live Arcade, that kind of thing, they showed no major increase in availability over earlier periods, suggesting that digitally distributed games may fall out of release as easily as other formats. Yep, so without there even being a form of physical media where you can just make a game appear on a hard drive, still not actually turning out well. So actually that's a lot of modern games just vanishing into the ether. These are games that people currently working in the industry actually have credits on. And now I'd say consider the impacts of digital storefronts. I think one digital storefront is the Xbox Live Arcade. I mean, if you're around my age, you'll probably remember Xbox Live Arcade. There's a lot of stuff there that is just gone, right? That's how it's ultimately going to end up being. And we actually covered this decently recently with the closure of the 8th gen stores in the past, where the PlayStation stores on the Vita and PS3, they were supposed to close. And then public outcry actually stopped that, gave it a stay of execution. And in theory, that does mean that hundreds of legacy games were preserved, right? 266 PS1, 104 PS2, 304 PSP games. And the PSP is surprisingly beloved by its more dedicated fan base. Same for the Vita as well, which is a console well ahead of its time. I mean, hey, even sporting an OLED screen all the way back then. But Actually, the study found that because of a bug with PlayStation Network accounts, no newly created accounts could actually access content on a PS3 or Vita without a community solution or workaround. And that does mean that as many as 674 PlayStation games reissued in North America may have actually fallen back out of release. And then moving to the Wii U and 3DS and their stores being shut down, the March 2023 closure meant that 121 Game Boy titles were removed from active distribution entirely. And that does mean that within the Game Boy family, there's almost no retained games. And like, that's the Game Boy, one of the most significant pieces of gaming hardware in history. And this shouldn't exactly be a surprise, because with a lack of physical copies that exist for preservation, digital stuff is just as susceptible to falling out of availability. I'd almost say that it's more susceptible to falling out of availability, and that does mean, I think, with all these stores, there is a little bit of a ticking time bomb. I mean, hell, even for more recent things, like we've covered so many instances of companies like just delisting their games from Steam, as an example, because they're no longer commercially viable. A lot of people seem to be feeling this as well with a lot of the big streaming services, which seemingly, I don't know if it's to skimp on royalties or like have a better, tax write-off or something, but a lot of TV shows and movies just being pulled from streaming services in a way that feels just like really quick and kind of mercenary to a lot of people, that's actually shaking, I think it really is shaking actually some people's confidence in the sustainability of like that medium. But anyway, that's why there's a really good tracking website called Delisted Games, where their owner was actually forced to seek support from interested parties, and they admitted in June that, quote, after 7 years of chronicling the comings and goings of game services, storefronts, and entire platforms, I am no longer able to keep up as more delistings and shutdowns seemingly happen every day. And it's because like me and you are playing, generally speaking, decently modern contemporary games, or maybe if they're older games like League of Legends or Counter-Strike, you could almost call them like forever games. Isn't it crazy that we haven't noticed that? I don't think I've noticed that. I don't think you've noticed that. It's a bit like how, when the geologists and the I don't know, paleontologists and stuff, they look in the fossil record and they see these like massive extinction events. And to us, they seem so unbelievably calamitous. But then you remember, oh wait, we're actually living in a mass extinction event literally right now. We just don't notice it. And it's a little bit like that, I think, with video games. I mean, probably a bit less important with video games, but still something that is kind of shocking, like a little, it's just bad. And that brings us to the likes of VGHF and other grassroots organizations that are basically realizing this is a problem, thinking, feck, we need to solve this. Even we have a recent one with NoClip. Right? NoClip, Danny O'Dwyer, they got a big old haul of marketing tapes that helped track the history of games via trailers, gameplay capture, and never before seen press releases and press previews of games. And I know there's a channel, I think it's called Gamers, but it's spelt funny with like a V in it or something, and they do these sort of documentaries. And I forget what it was, but it was just like archival footage of like E3 demos that are just basically impossible to find. They just have these entire, a company did this for 3 years, it didn't work out, Sony canceled the project, but actually look at a full game that could have happened. And it's just fascinating. Yet we're kind of robbed of all that because we obviously cannot rely on corporations to handle things like this. I mean, as an example, here in Northern Ireland, there's a group, NI Screen, and I'm sure you have a version in your region as well. I mean, how many TV shows have the big Georgia peach at the start because the state of Georgia's given them some money, or maybe a comedy group working with Screen Australia or something. So one of the things Northern Ireland Screen does is an archival project. Like archival footage of like, what did Belfast look like in 1900? Well, they find the footage, they archive it, and then that can be like licensed out to people. But there's kind of nobody doing any of that with games, because it's not really, I think, by a lot of those traditional power structures, treated as being important to the degree where we need a form of preservation that does not involve a commercial interest. And I think that's the thing that's kind of interesting. And it's where Embracer Group have been particularly fascinating. Now, I think some of Embracer's recent problems, like, could put this in jeopardy, could be a bit worrying, but they're basically trying to make the gaming equivalent of the seed vault in Svalbard. If you're not aware of that, there's like a big vault in Svalbard that has just all the seeds. All the seeds that we can find, all the different species of seed, they're there in the big seed vault for, I guess, science and the future. We don't really have that for games. But of course, it actually gets a little bit worse for games. And this is stuff that I believe even the ESA have lobbied against, which I think is truly quite awful. So Should you be able to go to a library or reach out to a preservation group and get access to a library copy of a video game? Let's say that you are interested in you're interested in cultural history of whatever, right? And as a part of your project, you want to find some video game, it's out of print, and in the same way you could go to like the big library in London to find some ancient book. Should you be able to do that with a video game? Most of us would say yes, because that's good. It doesn't have to involve a whole bunch of money. It can still just be good. And that's not all that different to say classic books, classic movies, and of course, digital files. I mean, you can borrow ebooks, you can borrow films in a digital fashion. Now, if that was the case with video games, you could research how developers did something specific with a game mechanic in the 80s. Maybe find a copy of something that was created by a company that's now buried in 5 layers of corporate acquisition, right? And even from a corporate angle, a constant, if tiny, stream of like revenue from library royalties, that would probably, I mean, it's better than no money at all, and it's not a massive headache for you. And it's not like companies are above just grabbing an emulated version of the game and selling it back to you, because that's exactly what Nintendo did with Super Mario Bros. In 2017. People basically cracked it open, they're like, hey, this is just an emulator. And it's like, yeah, of course it's just an emulator. And this is where it gets sad, because the actual holdup here is, in a way, the ESA. Now, the ESA, they're an industry body. They, of course, are also the people who kept on failing at making E3 work recently. But they've actually previously argued that if those groups wanted to do that, they could, but that they could not lend the media out or share it outside of the organization in any way. And the last round, unfortunately, of copyright review in the US went in their favor, which enshrined all of that. And the thing is, video games here are like the only medium that are subject to this criteria. Other forms of art, like, film, music, books, they don't have that. For games, they do. It's like, have the commercial interests perhaps got in the way of something good here? I wonder. So basically, because of how they're treating this, anybody wanting to take advantage of a great game collection for, say, research purposes, they would have to go to the physical location of the collection and access the media there. They couldn't take it home with them. They couldn't, like, rent it out, borrow it out, anything like that. And that functionally makes these collections of video game history useless. And all that does is, of course, point people towards emulation, which surely these companies don't like, because they obviously look at emulation like, oh, they've pirated our game that we're not willing to sell to anybody. How dare they? So there's a distinction, I think, between making something available and making something approachable. It's like, yeah, you've ticked the box, but in a way that doesn't really, like, fill the spirit of that. So it is just like what Gabe said, piracy is a service problem. Emulation is a service problem. People are emulating, fiddling around with DOS boxes and all that stuff because fundamentally they just can't access the games that they're actually interested in playing, because they have fallen into a weird black hole void where these companies simultaneously refuse to sell you the game or get the game into a shippable state, but also technically refuse any other way for you to get it, so you just end up being screwed. And then, of course, you're forced to emulate. So I think that this, from the Video Game History Foundation, is just a massive rebuke of the status quo. It's saying, listen, everybody, look at this graph. How is it that from 1995 to like 2004, we have less games preservation than from 1990 to 1994? How is this getting worse? And I think it's important that they're doing that, that they're putting the effort into that. Again, think about, a movie like The Exorcist or The Shining or like Vertigo or The Godfather even. Or like just a lot of those, older films that you can access. It's like you can't really do the video game version of that. And that just sucks, right? And I think the real reason why we've got to be aware of this is because next year, the DMCA review comes in, and that's where the ESA are going to be gearing up to defend this status quo. So that bad graph that we all saw where we see the preservation numbers are awful, that's what the ESA are going to be defending, right? And they've already begun to downplay that, because their president, Stanley Pierre-Louis, said to game developer, quote, "I don't know that I agree with the results of the Video Game History Foundation study or how they're characterizing it. There's a robust avenue for preservation to occur, and that is occurring." It's like, right, that's your own definition of robust and occurring. And also, how about you look at the numbers and look at how the numbers are low? I mean, surely as somebody working in the ESA, where you're basically existing, the line must go up, right? Line go up for the line god in the stock market. Surely then he must be able to understand a line going down and perhaps be alarmed by it. But no. And to end with a quote from Brandon Butler of the University of Virginia Library and Software Preservation Network, I think just the choice part is, the market will not preserve our history. That's not the market's job. And I think that's really the thing. Where does a market solution make sense? And many people would say, actually, for most things, a market-based solution does make sense. But I think, when you then go and think about like some other things, it's like, all right, maybe this isn't what the market is as well calibrated to do. And therefore, like how there are like government-funded bodies that are involved in the preservation of music and various other things like that, why do we not have that for our medium? And why are the advocates for the companies who make games, why are they lobbying against basically the interests of the art form? Because I think we're really getting to a point now where there's a big difference between the interests of the companies making these games and then the interests of the art form itself. And I think we've really forgotten the latter quite a lot indeed. I mean, is it any wonder we've forgotten the latter when so much of the discussion is destroyed by like monetization and all of these things that are like secondary to the art but kind of ruin it and mess it up. It's not like the old pure times of, yeah, here's my ticket, let me see the movie. And the movie itself just gets to be a movie, unruined. Of course, whenever the financial interests get overly weird and controlling with a movie, what do you get? Well, we get that era where randomly all the big Western movies also shoehorned in a whole bunch of China stuff, where you're just like, hey, I've absolutely no problem with a movie being set in China, but the way you're doing this just feels really contrived, as if it's for some external reason, and that makes the movie less good. In the same way that fucked about with our movies for a bit, this is fucking about with our games. And you know what? I don't like our games being fucked about with. And that is it for today's video. Let me know what you think. Do you have old games? One of the things that I like, whenever I walk through, say, QCon, it's a gaming and anime con that happens here in Belfast, or others, is you see like the kind of like wheeler dealers of the old retro games, right? Like I always think it's cool to see that, cool to see the retro stand. So what retro games do you have? I've got to say, I was actually a bit of a late bloomer in games. My first console was a PS2, Game Boy Advance before that. But yeah, it does mean that older era of games, unless it's on PC, I don't really know too much about it. Anyway, let me know. See you next time.